It was a bright, sunny day at the royal palace, a place where history and tradition mixed to create a sense of awe for anyone who visited. Tourists from all over the world walked through the massive gates, eager to experience the grandeur of the palace and witness the famous royal guards who stood outside. These guards, in their shiny uniforms and tall, impressive hats, were a symbol of the monarchy's strength and security. They were known for their discipline and strict training, never breaking their stoic expressions, no matter what happened around them. They were the heart of the palace's protection, and everyone who visited the palace could see them standing tall in front of the gates, silent and unmoving. Among the crowd of tourists was a group of young travelers who had come to see the palace as part of their vacation. They were excited, taking pictures of everything they could see, from the beautiful architecture to the intricate details on the royal banners. Their laughter filled the air as they marveled at the surroundings. Some of them had seen the royal guards before in photos or on television, but seeing them in person felt different. The guards looked so serious, so formal, and the tourists couldn't help but feel a sense of both awe and curiosity about them. One of the tourists, a young man, looked at his friends and whispered a mischievous idea. "What if we had a little fun with the guard?" he asked. His friends looked at each other, intrigued by the suggestion. The man continued, "Come on, it'll be harmless. We'll just tie him to the pole for a few minutes. He won't even notice." They all laughed at the idea, thinking it was a lighthearted prank that would add a bit of humor to their trip. Before anyone could stop him, the young man quietly approached the royal guard, who stood motionless, as he had been trained to do. The guard didn't flinch as the tourist tied a thick rope around his waist and then fastened it to a nearby pole. The other tourists, eager to witness what was happening, watched from a distance, chuckling and snapping pictures. The young man looked back at his friends with a proud smile, satisfied with the success of his prank. The royal guard, however, didn't react. He didn't flinch or even acknowledge the disturbance. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and his posture didn't waver. He had been trained to stand still, regardless of the situation, no matter how bizarre or uncomfortable it might be. It was a part of his job to maintain control of himself at all times, and he was doing just that. The tourists laughed louder, feeling victorious, thinking that they had somehow outsmarted the royal guard. They joked among themselves about how they had tied up such an important figure of the palace and how the guard was probably confused by their antics. They took more pictures, thinking of it as a funny memory to share with their friends later. But what they didn't know was that their joke, while harmless in their eyes, was far from over. They had no idea that their playful actions would soon lead to a series of events that would make them realize the seriousness of their behavior. As they continued to giggle and take more photos, a silent alarm was already going off in the background, and the royal guard's fellow officers were being alerted to the situation. What seemed like a harmless prank was about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. The tourists continued to laugh and joke, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The young man who had tied the royal guard to the pole looked around proudly, feeling like he had pulled off a successful prank. His friends were all taking photos, eager to post them online and share the funny moment with everyone they knew. It was like a scene from a movie, they thought, just a funny prank in a historic place. None of them considered that their actions might be more serious than they seemed. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained as calm as ever. His face, as usual, was completely expressionless. His eyes were fixed forward, not acknowledging the tourists or their antics. It was as if he didn't even notice the rope that bound him to the pole. But deep down, the guard was well aware of what was happening. He had been trained for moments like this, to deal with distractions, to ignore anything that might try to break his focus. His training told him that his job was to stand his ground, no matter how difficult or bizarre the situation became. But though he stayed still, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The young man's actions were not just a harmless joke. They were a challenge to his authority, to the very role he held as a protector of the palace. The guard didn't move, but he felt his pulse quicken. he had to remain still and show that nothing would break his composure. He had been through training for moments like this, where discipline mattered more than anything else. From a distance, no one could see the guard's internal struggle. To the tourists, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Some of them began to walk away, satisfied with their prank. But the young man who had tied the rope still lingered, watching the guard with a sense of triumph. The tourists were still laughing, joking among themselves about what a great story they would have to tell their friends. To them, the guard's silent demeanor seemed like part of the joke. They didn't realize that the seriousness of the situation was about to change. It wasn't long before one of the onlookers, who had been standing nearby and had grown uncomfortable with the scene, noticed what was going on. He glanced around, trying to figure out if anyone else had seen it. Slowly, he stepped forward, not sure what he should do. It felt wrong, but the scene wasn't exactly violent or dangerous, so he wasn't sure how to react. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should intervene, but his sense of right and wrong finally pushed him into action. The man, who was a local and had seen the royal guards many times, recognized that the situation was becoming serious. The tourists were clearly enjoying themselves, but something about it didn't sit well with him. He made a quick decision and pulled out his phone, making a discreet call to the local security team. He didn't know the full protocol, but he understood that the royal guards were not there for fun and games. He calmly explained what was happening and asked them to come and check on the situation. Meanwhile, the tourists were still too distracted by their fun to notice the shift in energy. The young man who had tied the rope didn't realize that things were about to escalate. He was still smiling, thinking that this harmless prank would be a funny story to share. What he didn't know was that his joke was far from over, and soon the reality of what he had done would set in. Behind the scenes, preparations were already being made to handle the situation, and before long, help would arrive in a way no one expected. As the tourists continued to snap photos and laugh at the royal guard, an uneasy feeling began to spread among some of the onlookers. While the pranksters seemed to think it was all in good fun, a few individuals in the crowd were starting to feel uncomfortable. They didn't like the idea of mocking someone who was just doing their job, even if he didn't show any reaction. One woman, who had been standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, glanced around nervously. She felt a tug in her conscience as she watched the young man tighten the rope around the guard. It didn't seem right. She took a deep breath, then slowly began to step forward, unsure of what to do. She wasn't sure if anyone else had noticed what was going on, but the thought of leaving the situation to play out made her feel uneasy. Her mind raced. Was this some sort of prank, or was it something worse? She didn't want to make a scene, but she also didn't want to be a silent bystander if things escalated. She could see that others were laughing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she took another step closer, she noticed that the royal guard was still standing completely still, his face as impassive as ever. He hadn't moved a muscle, his posture stiff and unyielding. But as she observed him, she could tell that he wasn't unaffected by what was happening. It wasn't the physical restraint that seemed to bother him. It was the idea that he was being treated like an object of ridicule. She could see a flicker of something in his eyes, though it was subtle, almost imperceptible. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an unmistakable tension in his stance. The woman hesitated for a moment longer, debating whether to approach the tourists or to wait for security to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, the situation started to feel more serious. She looked around at the growing crowd of tourists, some still taking pictures, others moving away, unaware of the tension that was building in the air. The woman took out her phone and quietly dialed the local security number. She briefly explained the situation, her voice low but urgent. "There's a royal guard tied to a pole. I think it's a prank, but it doesn't seem harmless anymore," she said. "Could someone come check it out?" She hung up the phone, but she didn't feel relieved. In fact, she felt even more uneasy. She was doing the right thing, But she couldn't shake the feeling that the tourists' laughter would soon turn to nervousness when they realized what was happening. As the minutes went by, she couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for security to arrive. Meanwhile, the young man who had tied the rope was still grinning, his friends laughing along with him. He didn't realize how much time had passed. He thought that any second now, the guard would react, or maybe even break character. But he didn't. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind that there might be consequences for his actions. All he cared about was how funny the situation seemed, how unusual it was to see someone in such a serious uniform caught up in something so silly. It wasn't until a few more people started to notice the growing tension in the crowd that the young man began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. He looked around, seeing the concerned expressions on some of the tourists' faces. Was it possible that this prank was crossing a line? He dismissed the thought, deciding to enjoy the moment. But inside, he couldn't ignore the subtle unease creeping in. Unbeknownst to him, the security team was already on their way. The call had been made, and the clock was ticking. The situation was about to change, quickly and unexpectedly. And as the young man smiled for one last picture, he had no idea that in a matter of moments, the fun he had been enjoying would soon turn into something far more serious. The game was about to end. As the young man stood there, still grinning at his prank, a few tourists began to notice the change in the atmosphere. Some of them looked around, sensing that things weren't as lighthearted as they had initially seemed. The laughter from the group started to fade as others in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. A couple of people who had been quietly observing the situation decided to move closer, unsure of what was happening, but instinctively feeling that the guard, despite his stillness, should be treated with more respect. The young man continued to take pictures, unaware of the growing discomfort around him. His friends encouraged him to take even more photos, laughing at how cool it was to be the ones who had tricked such an important figure. They joked that they would have a great story to tell their friends back home. Still, the moment felt different now. The laughter wasn't as carefree as it had been in the beginning, and some tourists were beginning to take out their phones too, but not for the same reasons. They had noticed the unease in the air, the way the guard was still, unmoving, despite the chaos happening around him. One of the onlookers, a man with a stern face, approached the young man. He didn't say anything at first, just gave him a sharp look. The man's expression told the young tourist everything he needed to know. It was a look that said, "What you're doing isn't funny anymore." The young man, for the first time, felt a knot of uncertainty in his stomach. He gave a nervous laugh, trying to shrug off the tension, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The onlooker stepped back, looking around as if waiting for someone else to intervene. At that moment, the young man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a text from one of his friends back home, but instead, it was a message from the local security. The message was short but clear. "We've received a report about a royal guard being tied to a pole. Please remain where you are. Help is on the way." The young man's heart skipped a beat. He had known something felt off. But now, seeing the message, he understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a harmless prank anymore. The local authorities were involved, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. A moment later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the crowd. The tourists' attention shifted, and they all turned to look at the direction of the sound. Within moments, a group of royal guards, moving swiftly and with purpose, appeared at the entrance to the palace grounds. They were dressed in their official uniforms, their boots echoing sharply on the cobblestones. The group, now visibly more serious, moved toward the young man and his friends. The tourists, who had been laughing moments before, fell silent, and the tension in the air grew heavier. The young man felt his smile falter as the squad of guards made their way toward him. He had been so confident earlier, thinking that the guards' lack of reaction meant there were no consequences. But now, seeing the royal guards approaching, the realization hit him hard. The prank was no longer funny, and it seemed that he and his friends had seriously miscalculated the situation. As the royal guard stepped closer, their eyes fixed on the young man. The crowd parted, giving them space. It wasn't long before the young man was face to face with one of the senior guards, a figure taller and more imposing than any of the others. The senior guard didn't waste any time. His tone was calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. "Unacceptable behavior," he said, his voice steady. The young man, now feeling the full force of the situation, gulped nervously. He tried to explain, but his words felt empty, like he was grasping for something to justify his actions. In the midst of the confusion and growing tension, the tourists began to realize that they had made a grave mistake. The laughter that once filled the air was replaced with a heavy silence. Some looked at the royal guards, others at the young man, and a few exchanged quiet whispers among themselves. The fun had ended, and now the situation was very real. The young man stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. His prank had gone too far, and now there was no way to undo it. What had started as a joke was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. The squad of guards, prepared to handle any situation, stood tall, waiting for the next move. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as the squad of royal guards gathered in front of the young man and his friends. The senior guard, now standing tall and confident, stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. His uniform glistened in the sunlight, his boots making a sharp, purposeful sound on the cobblestones. The young man, who had been feeling so proud of his prank just moments ago, now stood frozen in place, his heart racing. The senior guard's expression was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. He addressed the group with a steady, clear voice that cut through the awkward silence. "This is not a laughing matter. You are disturbing the peace and disrespected the very people who protect this palace." The words felt heavy, each one sinking deeper into the young man's chest, making him realize just how serious things had become. The tourists who had been watching the scene unfold shifted uncomfortably. Some stood still, unsure of what to do, while others glanced nervously at each other. The group of tourists, who had initially thought this would be a fun, harmless joke, now stood in shock, their smiles long gone. They had expected a harmless laugh, and maybe a playful scolding, but the reality of the situation was much more intense than they had imagined. The senior guard continued, his voice still firm but not angry. "You may not understand the role of the royal guard, but we are entrusted with an important duty. We stand for the security and dignity of this monarchy, and that must be respected." As the words hit home, the young man realized just how much he had underestimated the situation. What he had thought was a joke had turned into something far more significant. For a moment, the young man found himself unable to respond. He was filled with a mix of guilt and confusion. He had never intended for anything like this to happen. It was supposed to be a funny, quick prank, but now he understood that it wasn't just about a tied rope. It was about respect. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out the way he intended. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice quiet. The senior guard raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We are not here to punish you," he said, his tone now softening slightly. "However, your actions will have consequences." The guard's words were not threatening, but they made it clear that this would not be taken lightly. The young man looked around, feeling the weight of the moment. He was surrounded by an entire squad of well-trained, disciplined guards, all of whom were watching him closely. For a few seconds, there was silence, and the crowd that had gathered seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The tourists who had been laughing just moments ago now stood still, watching with wide eyes, some in shock, others in disbelief. They had seen pranks gone wrong before, but this was on another level. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, and the young man was no longer smiling. He realized just how close they had come to a dangerous situation. The senior guard turned to his squad and nodded. Without a word, the other guards moved to untie the rope that bound the royal guard to the pole. They worked quickly, with precision and efficiency. The young man, still standing there, watched in silence, feeling more and more regretful. He had thought this would be a funny story for his friends, but now it was a lesson in respecting others, especially those who had important jobs to do. As the rope was untied and the royal guard was finally freed, the senior guard addressed the group one last time. Consider this a lesson. What might seem like harmless fun can quickly turn into something much more serious. You have disrespected not just the royal guard, but also the honor of this institution. The senior guard's voice was still calm, but there was a firmness to it that made it clear this was not something that would be easily forgotten. The young man nodded silently, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had no words left. What could he say? He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The rest of the tourists, who had once been entertained by the scene, now stood silently, their expressions sober. It was clear that they too had learned something in this moment. The joke had ended, and now the reality of respect and consequences had taken center stage. The tension in the air was thick as the senior guard finished speaking. For a moment, no one moved or said anything. The tourists, still in shock from the unfolding events, glanced nervously at one another. They had been caught off guard by how serious the situation had become, and they realized, perhaps too late, that their actions had consequences. The young man who had tied the royal guard to the pole felt his stomach churn with a deep sense of regret. He couldn't believe how quickly something meant to be a simple prank had spiraled out of control. The royal guard, now free from the rope that had bound him, straightened his uniform and stood tall, his face still stoic as ever. He didn't speak, didn't make any gestures to show he had been affected by the situation. He simply returned to his position, silently resuming his role as the protector of the palace. His quiet strength seemed to underline the seriousness of the moment. While the tourists were caught up in their own discomfort, he remained composed and unflinching, just as he had been trained to do. The young man felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a prank could cause such a disruption. He had thought that tying the guard to the pole would be harmless, just a funny memory from his trip to the royal palace. But now, standing in front of the squad of royal guards, he saw the seriousness behind their role. The guard wasn't just standing there to look impressive. He was part of something far larger, something that required respect and understanding. The young man's eyes dropped to the ground, feeling small and foolish. The senior guard watched him for a moment longer before turning to the rest of the tourists. His voice softened a little, though still carrying the authority of someone who had seen far more serious situations than this one. "I hope this serves as a reminder," he said, his eyes scanning the group. "You may be visitors, but you are guests in this palace, and we expect a certain level of respect for the traditions and the people who serve here." His tone was not angry, but it was firm, and it resonated deeply with the group. It was a quiet but powerful lesson on understanding the boundaries between lightheartedness and respect. The young man wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't meant for things to get so out of hand, but the words didn't come. What could he say? He had already seen the look of disappointment on the faces of the guards, and he could feel the regret inside him growing. The senior guard's words had hit their mark. He understood now. He had crossed a line, and there was no easy way to undo what had been done. The tourists began to move away, some still unsure of what to do. They had been part of something that seemed like fun, but now they understood that their actions had affected more than just themselves. The seriousness of the situation began to settle in. It wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. It was about respect for the people who served and protected important places like the palace. As the crowd started to disperse, the young man stayed behind, staring at the royal guard. The guard was still standing tall, his face as impassive as it had been before, as if nothing had happened. But the young man saw something different in him now. He saw the quiet dignity of someone who wasn't just a figurehead for tourists to laugh at, but a person who held an important role in the protection of the monarchy. His heart sank as he realized how wrong he had been to treat him as part of a joke. The senior guard, sensing that the situation had reached its end, gave the young man one last look. It wasn't a harsh look, but it was enough to let him know that this lesson wouldn't be forgotten. "Remember," the senior guard said softly, "actions have consequences. We don't take these responsibilities lightly. Neither should you." Then, with a final nod, the senior guard turned, signaling for the rest of the squad to follow. They began to walk back to their posts, leaving the young man standing alone, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The young man took a deep breath, trying to process the events of the last few minutes. He had come to the palace with the intention of having fun, but what he had learned was far more valuable than any silly joke. He understood now that respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding the importance of the roles others play and honoring their dignity. As the guards disappeared into the distance, he felt a sense of responsibility settle on his shoulders. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The young man stood there, his mind racing, as he watched the royal guards walk away. His friends had already started to leave, whispering among themselves about what had just happened, but he couldn't bring himself to move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his eyes fixed on the spot where the senior guard had stood moments earlier. The whole experience felt like a dream, a strange, surreal moment where what seemed like harmless fun had turned into something much more meaningful. He could still hear the senior guard's words echoing in his mind. Actions have consequences. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the situation that bothered him. It was the feeling of deep regret that had settled in his chest. He had made a mistake, a big one, and now there was no way to take it back. What had started as a simple prank had turned into a lesson he never expected to learn that day. He hadn't realized how important the royal guard was, how much history and tradition were tied up in that uniform. He hadn't understood that the guard wasn't just a figure to pose next to for a picture. He was there to protect something much bigger than himself. As he stood there, the reality of the situation finally hit him. He thought back to how he had felt when he first arrived at the palace. The excitement of being somewhere so historic, the thrill of being a tourist in such a famous place. He had seen the royal guards before in pictures and on television, but they had always seemed like a distant part of a story, not something real and important. He had never taken the time to consider what they actually did or why they were there. Now, looking back, he realized how wrong he had been to treat them like a joke. He glanced at his friends, who were slowly drifting away, still chatting excitedly about their day. They had moved on quickly, their attention already shifting to the next part of their tour. But the young man couldn't shake the feeling that he couldn't just move on from this. The lesson he had learned wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. He knew he needed to reflect on it, to understand why what he did had been wrong. The sound of footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. He turned to see the royal guard from earlier, the one who had been tied to the pole, now walking past him. His face was still as expressionless as before, his movements precise and measured. The young man watched as the guard continued his rounds, unfazed by what had happened. It was as though the whole incident hadn't affected him at all. But the young man knew better. The guard's calm exterior was a result of years of training, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty. He had not been moved by the prank, but the young man could tell that it had affected him in ways he couldn't fully understand. For a moment, the young man considered going up to the guard, apologizing for what had happened, but he quickly dismissed the thought. It wasn't his place to interrupt the guard's duties. Besides, no apology would change what had happened. What mattered now was the lesson that had been taught, not just to him, but to everyone who had witnessed the incident. He turned and began walking away from the scene, his thoughts still lingering on the events that had unfolded. As he moved through the palace grounds, he felt a sense of responsibility that had never been there before. He had been a part of something that had gone wrong, but now he had the opportunity to learn from it and do better in the future. He knew that respect wasn't just something you showed when it was convenient. It was something you earned by understanding the value of others and their roles in the world. The young man couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the royal guard. Though the situation had been uncomfortable, it had opened his eyes to something much larger than himself. He had learned that respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about recognizing the importance of others, whether they were guarding a palace, working a simple job, or playing a part in any other aspect of life. As he continued to walk, he promised himself that he would remember this lesson, and maybe, just maybe, one day, he would return to the palace, not as a tourist eager for a joke, but as someone who truly understood the significance of what he had experienced. As the young man walked away from the royal guards and the scene that had unfolded, a sense of quiet reflection began to settle over him. His thoughts were still racing, but there was a certain clarity that had begun to form in his mind. The earlier tension had left him feeling uneasy, but now it was replaced with a deeper understanding of respect and responsibility. He couldn't shake the image of the royal guard, standing tall, unfazed, and utterly composed, even after what had happened. The guard had shown him a level of self-discipline and dignity that he couldn't help but admire. He looked back toward the palace, the grand building still looming in the distance, and realized how much he had taken for granted. The palace wasn't just a place of historical significance. It was a symbol of the monarchy, of centuries of tradition, and of the people who worked tirelessly to protect it. The royal guards weren't just standing there for show. They were part of a legacy, one that deserved recognition and respect. The young man had come to the palace expecting to see the sights, take a few pictures, and have some fun. He hadn't expected to leave with a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As he continued walking, he felt a slight shift in his perspective. He had always thought of himself as someone who understood basic respect for others. But now he realized that true respect went beyond simply being polite. It was about recognizing the value in what others did, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. What had seemed like a harmless prank in the beginning had now shown him the importance of understanding and appreciating the roles people play in the world. He couldn't help but think of the times in his life when he had taken things for granted, when he hadn't fully understood the effort that went into something until it was too late. He felt a slight pang of guilt as he walked past the other tourists who were still buzzing with excitement, talking animatedly about the day's events. They were oblivious to the deeper implications of what had just occurred. To them, it was just another story to share, another funny memory to keep. But for the young man, the experience had turned into something much more meaningful. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that he knew he couldn't forget. The young man eventually found a quiet spot near the gardens, away from the crowds of tourists. He sat on a bench and took a moment to absorb everything that had happened. The calm surroundings, the gentle breeze, and the beauty of the palace grounds helped clear his mind. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure what had changed inside him, but he knew that he was seeing things differently. The guard's stoic presence had left a lasting impression on him. It wasn't just the discipline of the guard that stood out, but the silent strength he had shown in the face of the prank. The young man now understood that true strength wasn't about physical power or authority. It was about composure and dignity, no matter the situation. As he sat there, he realized that the lesson wasn't just about the royal guards or the palace. It was about how he viewed the world and the people around him. Everyone, no matter their role, deserved respect. The young man thought back to his own life. How often had he overlooked the efforts of others, assuming they were just doing their jobs? How many times had he taken someone's hard work for granted? It was a humbling thought, and one that made him feel more connected to the world around him. Eventually, the young man stood up from the bench and looked around one last time. The palace was still there, as magnificent as ever, but now it represented something more to him. It was a reminder of the importance of respect, of recognizing the value in others, and of learning from experiences that at first might seem insignificant. As he walked back toward the exit, he knew that he would carry this lesson with him, not just in his next visit to a historic place, but in his everyday life. He had learned that respect, like trust, was something that had to be earned and maintained, and that every person, regardless of their role, played a part in something larger than themselves. It was a lesson that would guide him for years to come, and as he left the palace behind, he felt a sense of gratitude. It was a lesson learned in a way he had never expected, but one that would stay with him forever.